Hi everyone, Corie here, and it's weekly recap time. This week we are finishing off the Old Testament of the Bible. If you don't know who I am, check out the description box below because I work with Bible Discovery and Bible Discovery TV, and we are taking you through the Bible in a year, this year. So our assigned reading brought us to the end of the Old Testament this week. So we're starting off in Zephaniah. We're doing Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, so that in tomorrow's reading, you can just start right in that New Testament and keep on going. So let's just jump right in. Zephaniah Chapter 1. So this is a prophetic book. All four of these books are considered in the minor prophets because they're shorter. So Zephaniah, the son of Cushai, introduces himself in the beginning of this book. He was in the royal line of David. So one of his great-grandfathers was King Hezekiah, if you can believe it. So Zephaniah gets his vision during the reign of Josiah, the king of Judah. So he's in the royal family. He would have been related to Josiah, which is an interesting dynamic. And this time period makes Zephaniah contemporary, so alive at the same time as Jeremiah the prophet and Nahum the prophet, and perhaps even Habakkuk the prophet as well. So in chapter 1, Zephaniah sees a vision of God's judgment on the whole earth, the entire planet, all of mankind. And interestingly, verse 3 says this: I will sweep away both man and beast. I will sweep away the birds in the sky and the fish in the sea and the idols that cause the wicked to stumble. Now, what strikes me as interesting about that verse is the order of it. So this order mimics the creation back in Genesis, except it goes backwards. It goes man, beast, birds, fish, rather than fish, birds, beasts, man, right? So this reversal of the order may be intended to be read as God kind of doing a decreation of the earth, which is an interesting thought. God's judgment being a reversal of the creation. So the whole point of Zephaniah chapter 1 is that God's judgment is coming on all of mankind because of sin. Zephaniah chapter 2, this is a call to Judah specifically to repent and seek God, to do God's commands, to do the law with humility, and perhaps you will be spared from this judgment that's coming. Perhaps you'll be sheltered from the wrath of God. It goes in to talk specifically about the land of Philistia, that it will, instead of being richly inhabited, the land of the Philistines, instead of all of that, it will become flocks for the remnant of Judah. So the population is basically going to be wiped out. The cities are going to be gone, and it's going to be pasture land. It talks about specifically the nations of Moab and Ammon, and because of how these nations mocked God and mistreated the people of God, their land is going to be destroyed like Sodom and Gomorrah. So it's going to become like a wasteland. It's not going to be rebuilt. Also, there's a very brief sentence in there that judgment will come on the nation of Cush. And then it talks about how Assyria will be destroyed as well. And Nineveh specifically, which of course became the capital city of Assyria, it's going to be left as a ruin in the desert, and it's going to become a haunt for desert animals. All right, last chapter of Zephaniah is chapter 3. And this, interestingly enough, is God. It's from the perspective of God, and he's talking about his experience with Jerusalem, how he's remained faithful, he's remained present throughout Jerusalem's rebellion, and he will judge her because of this rebellion when he judges the rest of the nations. So comeuppance is coming for all of mankind, is this general thrust of Zephaniah. Also in chapter 3, it talks about how God will cleanse from Israel the arrogant, specifically, and he's going to, once the arrogant are gone, he's going to purify the lips of the remnant, whoever remains in Israel, who's made it through the judgment. And this purification of the lips is so that they can call on God again, and he's going to bring them back to Jerusalem. So there's still that hope. There are going to be survivors. There is going to be a remnant. This remnant's guilt and punishment will be taken away from them, and God will be with them. God's going to be a mighty warrior to save them. That's the phrase that's used in Zephaniah 3, and God will rejoice over these people with singing. So it ends on a high note, despite the rest of the overall negative tone of Zephaniah. All right, moving along, Haggai, the book of Haggai. So Haggai jumps quite ahead in the timeline of the Bible. So we were just back in the time period of Josiah, when the kings of Judah are still on the throne and they're awaiting kind of the Babylonian invasion. But this is way after the Babylonian invasion happened, after the exile happened, after the Persians took over the Babylonian Empire and allowed exiles to return to Jerusalem specifically to rebuild the temple. Okay, so this is the time period that Haggai brings us to. So it's dated specifically to the second year of King Darius of Persia, which is about 520 BC. So that's where we are on the historical timeline. Okay, Haggai chapter 1, God gives a prophecy to Haggai specifically for the governor of Judah, who's named as Zerubbabel, and to the high priest Joshua. And God's message is that the people aren't being as successful as they want to be in the land in terms of their crops and their harvest yields because they have not rebuilt the temple. And that was what they were supposed to do in the first place. So God tells them, I'm with you, and you need to build the temple now. So the people begin to obey here in Haggai chapter 1. Haggai chapter 2, this is a message, again, of encouragement to the leaders and the people of Judah, especially the people who are old enough to remember what the temple once looked like. It's this encouragement that God's presence in his glory are going to be in Jerusalem again. They're going to inhabit this new temple, even though it's going to be less glorious than, Solomon's temple was. God tells the people to note this very day that they began laying the foundation of the temple, because from this day forward, God will noticeably bless them for their faithfulness and for their obedience to him. So before they were having difficulty with their crops, but now from this day forward, they're going to notice an increased yield of the land for them. God's going to bless them and start to honor that old Mosaic covenant that he had with them before. A message is given to Zerubbabel, that governor of Judah, that God has chosen him to lead specifically, and that while nations around him will fall, God will establish the leadership of Zerubbabel, because Zerubbabel has become like God's signet ring. So carrying God's authority, able to make decisions with God's authority. That's what a signet ring did, or signet seal did. Now, this is important because if you remember back in Jeremiah chapter 22, God essentially decommissioned the Davidic line for a while. He said to Jehoiachin, even if you were a signet ring on my hand, I would still pull you off. So by God referring to Zerubbabel, a descendant of David, as a governor of Judah in this time, referring to him as a signet seal, you have become as a signet ring on my hand. This is recommissioning the Davidic line for leadership. And this is extremely important because the Messiah, the branch, this future king and priest, is supposed to come from the line of David that's been decommissioned. So, recommissioned, very exciting here. All right, next book of the Bible, Zechariah Chapter 1. So, Zechariah, son of Berechiah, that's what we're told his name is, his designation is. He's a contemporary of Haggai. He is a priest of the temple, and he's also a prophet. So they're tag teaming this, Haggai and Zechariah. Now, according to the New Testament, when we get, to the end of Matthew, I believe it's in Matthew chapter 23, it talks about how there was a Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, who was murdered between the temple and the altar. So if this is the same guy, which it definitely sounds like it is, his end was not nice. but his book is very interesting. So let's do Zechariah chapter 1. So this is a message to the returned exiles. God says to them, return to me, and I will return to you. So it's this extension of, we can renew the covenant here. If you want to be my covenant people again, I want to be your covenant God again. Zechariah then sees a vision of a man mounted on a red horse with other horses behind him. And they're giving a report on the status of the nations of the world. And the nations are at peace. That's their status. Now, this is not a good thing that the other nations of the world are at peace, because they're evil, they're sinful. So God says then that these other nations had gone too far in their punishment of Israel. God wanted them to punish Israel and Judah, but they just took it way too far in their wrath and their zeal and their judgment. So God will restore Jerusalem and Judah and the temple. Zechariah then, the vision switches, and he sees 4 horns. Horns in the Old Testament are always represented, even in the New Testament, in the Bible, and in the ancient Near East. Horns represent power. So these 4 horns represent the power of the nations that scattered Israel. And Zechariah sees God sending out craftsmen to these horns to bring them down. So the nations are going to lose their power because of them going too far in judgment against Israel. Zechariah chapter 2, this is a promise that Jerusalem will be so big, the population will be so plentiful that the city won't have walls anymore, because the walls won't be able to contain the population, and that God himself will be a protective wall of fire around his people. There's also a messianic message given in Zechariah chapter 2, verses 10 to 11, and I want to read it to you. It says this: "Shout and be glad, daughter Zion, for I am coming, and I will live among you, declares the Lord. Many nations will be joined with the Lord in that day, and will become my people. I will live among you, and you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me to you." So it switches to this messianic kind of figure. You will know that the Lord has sent me to you, and many nations will be joined with the Lord in that day and will become my people, will become God's people. All right, Zechariah chapter 3. This is a very interesting scene that's played out for us here. Joshua the high priest is standing before the angel of the Lord in disgusting, dirty clothing, and Satan is standing by, and he's accusing Joshua before the angel of the Lord. The angel of the Lord rebukes Satan. "Go away. I'm not listening to all of your accusations against this man." And he has Joshua stripped of his dirty clothes, and he clothes him in clean clothes. And verse 4, the second half of verse 4 says this: "Then he said to Joshua, 'See, I have taken away your sin. I will put fine garments on you.'" And then he tells Joshua to follow him all of his days. And then this, verses 8 and 9. "Listen, high priest Joshua, you and your associates seated before you, who are men symbolic of things to come. I am going to bring my servant, the branch. See the stone I have set in front of Joshua? There are 7 eyes on that one stone, and I will engrave an inscription on it, says the Lord Almighty. And I will remove the sin of this land in a single day." So this whole scene is a messianic prophecy. It's looking forward to this Messiah figure who will take away the sins of the land in one day and will have the power to take away all of, humanity's good works that are sinful. They're those dirty rags that Joshua the high priest was wearing, and put clean clothes on the individual so that they can stand with integrity before God Almighty. And then that stone, I just want to make a quick note, that stone, I'm not going to do too much in interpreting the stone for you, but it says there is 7 eyes on that one stone, and I will engrave an inscription on it. So if we remember, Joshua is the high priest, and in the ephod of the high priest, there were already 12 gemstones in there, and they were engraved. They were engraved each with a name of one of the tribes of Israel on it. So then there's this new stone that has 7 eyes on it, and God is going to engrave maybe a name on that stone. So it's really interesting. There's going to be, perhaps a new tribe of Israel, perhaps a new thing that God is doing. It's very interesting. Zechariah Chapter 4. In this chapter, Zechariah sees a golden lampstand with 2 olive trees on either side of the lampstand, and they're making and providing oil to keep the lampstand lit. Now, these 2 olive trees, in the chapter itself, it says these are the ones who are fueling the lamp, right? So it's individuals who are anointed to do this task. This is likely referring to Haggai and Zechariah, the prophets who are providing God's word to the people as they're trying to build the temple. Although some people have interpreted this as the olive trees are Joshua the high priest and Zerubbabel the governor. Also in Zechariah 4, there's a promise that Zerubbabel will be able to finish this second temple, this rebuilt temple. All right, Zechariah Chapter 5, so many visions of this prophet. In this one, he sees a flying scroll, and this scroll turns out to be a curse against thieves and liars, a curse to banish them from the land. And God says it will go through the land and it will remain in the homes of any thieves or liars who have remained in the land until their homes are destroyed. Then Zechariah looks up and he sees a basket flying overhead. And when he looks into the basket, there's a woman in this basket. And this basket and the woman represent the collective sin of the people of the land. And the angel puts a lid on the basket, and then 2 angels who are described as women with wings like a stork who are flying, they pick up the basket and carry it off to bring it to Babylon. So they're bringing the sins of the people to the enemy of God, apparently to face judgment. All right, Zechariah Chapter 6. In this chapter, the prophet sees 4 chariots, and they come out from between 2 mountains of bronze. And the horse teams that are pulling these 4 chariots are red, black, white, and dappled. And in Zechariah, we're not given an explanation for the colors of the horses, but we are told that they are the spirits of heaven going out into the world, and they end up subduing the land to the north, which is Babylon, right, where the sins of the people have just been sent. The enemy of God is residing in Babylon. So they've gone and they have dealt with that land of the north, that Babylon. Next, another very symbolic thing happens. A crown of gold is made, and it's set on the head of Joshua the high priest. Then it's given to 4 men, 4 priests apparently, and they're to keep it in the temple, in the second temple, as a memorial that one day God will send that Messiah. He will send the branch, and that branch will be both a priest and a king. Zechariah Chapter 7. This is a physical one now. We've moved out of visions and we've moved into the physical world. People from the city of Bethel send a delegation to Jerusalem, to the temple, to inquire of the Lord, to see if they should still mourn and fast in the 5th month like they had been doing since the exile. And God's response to them is really interesting. He says, you fasted for yourselves. The exile was punishment for the lost morality of the people of Israel. So rather than fasting, rather than mourning, you need to live with God's morality. You need to fulfill the covenant. Stop with the fasting in the morning. Fulfill the covenant with God. Zechariah Chapter 8. This is more encouragement that, though it doesn't look like it right now to the people who are living in Jerusalem, one day the streets of Jerusalem will be filled with multiple generations of people again. There'll be grandparents and children living in the streets of Jerusalem. So the people need to believe that message of hope, and they need to be strong and finish the temple. God also encourages them, you need to speak truthfully. You need to have justice in your courts. And I don't want you to plot evil or lie. So again, this is follow the covenant, live with the right morality again. And there's a promise again that God's blessing on the land is there. So focus on building the temple. God will worry about making sure you have enough food. Zechariah chapter 9, this is all about how God will bring judgment on Israel's enemies, and that those survivors that remain of those enemy nations, they will become God's people. So whoever lives through the judgment of God will become a part of God's nation. Also in Zechariah chapter 9, very interestingly, it talks about Zion's coming king. So there's a prophecy here of the king entering Jerusalem lowly and riding on a donkey on a colt, the foal of a donkey is the wording there. So of course this was fulfilled with Jesus in his triumphal entry in the Gospels. Zechariah chapter 10, this is all about, the whole chapter is about how God will care for and restore Judah as a nation. Zechariah chapter 11, this is a chapter about two different kinds of shepherds, and Zechariah has to physically act out these prophecies. So first he has to act out what's already happened in the past with the Babylonian exile, so what led to the Babylonian exile, and basically it's this rejection of God as a shepherd. So based off of this rejection of God as a shepherd, or Zechariah acting as God as a shepherd of the people, Zechariah breaks a shepherd's staff that he had named Favor, showing that, the covenant between God and the sheep, God and the people, was broken. Then Zechariah goes to the priests and asks for his payment for being the shepherd, and they pay him 30 pieces of silver for his work in shepherding. And this is really insulting because this is the price of a slave, not the price of a good shepherd watching over the sheep. So Zechariah throws the money into the place of the potter, where pottery was made in the temple complex. And this is going to all come into play in the New Testament Gospels, where some interesting things is going to be claimed about this. So Zechariah then breaks the staff that he called union, and this is showing the division between Judah and Israel. Zechariah then, after he represents what has happened in the past, then he becomes this foolish shepherd who doesn't take care of the sheep at all, but he ends up just eating the best sheep. So he just picks it out selfish. Oh, I'm going to eat you for dinner. And this is a warning for the people that they get the shepherd that they deserve. So they need to be careful. And it's also a warning for those worthless shepherds who would try to just use the people for their own benefit, that they're not going to last. It's not going to end well for them. Zechariah chapter 12. Now, we're starting to focus on future. In the future, when nations gather against Jerusalem to destroy her again, they will not be able to succeed, but rather those nations that try to destroy her themselves will end up destroyed. It talks about how Jerusalem will be like an intoxicating cup, that anyone who comes to try to attack her will drink of this cup and end up just being intoxicated and losing the battle. It also talks about Jerusalem as a fire pot, that when people come to try to attack her, they'll end up being set on fire and having to flee. And also Jerusalem as a rock, where when people try to come and move the rock, they will end up injuring themselves. So pretty clear message here that Jerusalem's around to stay. After this battle, with the nations gather against Jerusalem, Jerusalem will mourn the one that they pierced. Verse 10b says this: they will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn son. Now, Christians, we look at this and we see Jesus. We see the rejection of Jesus and then the acceptance of Jesus, the one who was pierced for our iniquities. Zechariah chapter 13. This is all about how the mourning and the grief over the one that they have pierced, you know, back in chapter 12, this changes into a fountain that opens up to the house of David and to all of Jerusalem that will cleanse them from their sin and impurity. So their recognition of God, of the Messiah, of his salvation for them, that opens up into an opportunity for their very salvation. Idols will be banished from the land and prophecy will be done. They won't need prophecy anymore because the Messiah will be there and God will be among them. There is a prophecy in Zechariah chapter 13, verses 7 to 9, about God striking the shepherd who's close to God. So a good shepherd, God striking the good shepherd so that the sheep will be scattered, and how judgment and refinement will follow this striking. And very interestingly, Jesus quotes these verses in the Gospels in Matthew 26 and Mark 14 regarding his crucifixion. Last chapter of Zechariah, we're getting really close to the end. Zechariah 14. So a different perspective is given here of that final battle when the nations surround Jerusalem and how God will save Jerusalem. However, Jerusalem won't actually escape without injury. The city will initially be brutally captured and half the population will be exiled. However, then God will fight for Israel and there will be a great earthquake and a valley, like a rift, will actually open up in Israel. And a freshwater river, a life-giving river, will actually flow from Jerusalem. And the rest of the nations of the world will be struck with some sort of deadly plague. But Jerusalem will be secure, and all the survivors of the surrounding nations, they will go up to Jerusalem to worship God. So I know there is a lot going on in that chapter, but I've tried to summarize it as best as is possible. All right, so that is the last chapter of Zechariah, and we're going to move into the very last book of the Old Testament, which is Malachi. It is only 4 chapters. Okay, Malachi Chapter 1. So, in Malachi's time, the temple, that second temple, had been rebuilt, but God raises up Malachi to bring a really concerning message. Because we've got off on the right foot with Haggai and Zechariah. It sounds like everything's going well, but then Malachi, we learn that Israel is doubting God's love, and Israel is offering blemished animals. And they're begrudging the sacrificial system altogether, the requirements of the temple, the requirements of the law. So God tells the people through Malachi, this is a problem. And essentially, if you don't worship God, the other nations are going to worship God. Malachi Chapter 2. So this is about how the priests had decided, the priests of the new temple have decided not to honor God's name. And so they're cursed. They will be humiliated because they have shown partiality in the matters of the law. They're deciding on their own what's right and what's wrong in the law. They've betrayed the covenant of God. Also, really distressingly, men of Judah have begun to marry women who worship other gods. But worse than this, just this violation, see, they were allowed to marry foreign women, but as long as those foreign women decided to worship the true God and not keep their religions. But what's worse about all of this is we learn that these men are divorcing their God-honoring wives to marry these women who are worshiping other gods. And then they have the audacity to go and cry at the temple and mourn and wail at the temple because God's not blessing their harvests. So Malachi connects these dots for them. Guys, this is why this is happening, because you're so far away already from the covenant. God tells the men in this chapter to be on guard for their own unfaithfulness, to be faithful to the wives of their youth, And God says, the man who hates and divorces his wife does violence to the one he should be protecting. So be on your guard and don't be unfaithful. So unfaithfulness is not just something that we have to fall into. We can be on guard against unfaithfulness, not only to our spouses, but also to God, if we're looking out for the patterns of behavior that the Bible shows us, and that our very consciences will testify to us, this is wrong. This is a path that will lead to adultery, either against God or against my spouse. We have a choice at that moment, which path are you going to take? And so God's telling these people, be on guard and do not be unfaithful. Malachi Chapter 3, it's an accusation that the people are breaking God's covenant through injustice, and how God will refine them and purify them. And there's this question, who will stand? It's dubious. Which one of you is going to make it through this purification process? They are also breaking the covenant by robbing God. This means they're not honoring God with their tithes or their sacrifices. So things that are meant for God in the covenant that they have with him, they're actually withholding from him. They are also breaking the covenant by saying that it doesn't benefit them to follow the covenant. We're getting away with testing God. God's not really blessing our harvest anyway, so what's the big deal? But they had already fallen away from the covenant, which is why God wasn't blessing. So the people who listened to this message from Malachi and it disturbed them and they began to try, their names are written down on a scroll of remembrance because God says you're going to become the next remnant. It's based, our eternal destiny is based off of our response to God's word. It's always been that way, as we can see here through Malachi. Okay, last chapter of the Old Testament of the Bible. Judgment will come on the wicked, but the remnant will survive and be healed. And there's a very, very cool verse in there. It says this, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its rays, and you will go out and frolic like well-fed calves. So hope is what the last chapter of the Old Testament offers us, that even in the midst of unfaithfulness, God is faithful. And though we all have to go through a refining process and it's not going to be comfortable and we may have to go through judgment, there is healing and there is life on the other side. There's also a promise. The very last promise of the Old Testament is that God will send Elijah to come before him and prepare the way. And that is the very interesting way that the Old Testament ends. As always, if you have any comments and questions, pop them down in the comments below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can.